Vampire King scolded her for being late to the ball. Then sees the bandages. She hid Chapter 1. The Scarlet Invitation. The invitation had arrived 3 days ago, sealed in black wax, stamped with a crimson rose, the mark of House Dragomir. Clara Ashford had burned it immediately, watching the parchment curl and blacken in her fireplace. But the second invitation arrived the next morning, and the third the morning after that. Each one bore the same message in elegant script. Your presence is required at the midwinter ball. Refusal is not advised. Now, standing before the iron gates of Dragomir Manor as midnight bells tolled across the mist-shrouded valley, Clara understood that some invitations were commands dressed in courtesy. The manor rose before her like a Gothic cathedral carved from shadow and stone. Pointed arches stretched toward a moonless sky, and narrow windows glowed with the amber light of what must have been 1,000 candles. The air smelled of old roses and something metallic she couldn't quite name. Clara's hands trembled as she adjusted her gloves, making sure the bandages beneath were completely hidden. The cuts on her wrists and forearms were still fresh, only 5 days old, and the shame of them burned hotter than the wounds themselves. She'd been so careful with the long sleeves of her burgundy gown, the high collar, the delicate lace that covered everything that needed covering. No one could know. Especially not them. The gates swung open without a sound, though no servant stood nearby. Clara's stomach twisted. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the valley had. The Dragomir family had ruled these lands for centuries, appearing in portraits that dated back to the 1400s, yet never seeming to age. They held court in the darkness, made laws that even the mayor obeyed, and those who crossed them simply disappeared. And they never, ever invited mortals to their gatherings. Until now. Clara forced herself to walk through the gates. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she approached the massive entrance doors. They opened before she could knock, revealing an entrance hall that stole her breath. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their candlelight reflecting off polished marble floors. A grand staircase swept upward, its banister carved with intricate patterns of thorns and roses. And everywhere, there were people dressed in clothes that ranged from medieval splendor to modern elegance, all watching her with eyes that caught the light strangely. The voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. Every head turned. The crowd parted. He stood at the top of the staircase, one hand resting on the banister, and Clara's first coherent thought was that no human man had ever looked like that. Tall and lean, dressed entirely in black save for a deep crimson cravat, he radiated the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. His hair was dark as ink, swept back from a face of sharp angles and cold beauty. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, pale silver, almost colorless, ancient and knowing. The invitation specified midnight precisely, he continued, descending the stairs with a predator's grace. Clara found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. The roads were difficult in the dark, my lord. He reached the bottom of the stairs, and Clara realized with a shock that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He was studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. We have laws, Miss Ashford, ancient laws. How did he know her name? She hadn't been announced. I didn't mean to offend, Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. It wasn't a question. He circled her slowly, and she felt dozens of other eyes watching this exchange with predatory interest. Then perhaps you can explain why you smell of... He stopped mid-sentence. His nostrils flared slightly. Blood, he finished, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her arms closer to her sides, praying the bandages would hold. His hand shot out, faster than she could track, and caught her left arm. Not roughly, but with absolute certainty. It's nothing, Clara said quickly, trying to pull away. His grip didn't budge. A gardening accident. Please, He turned her arm over, and before she could stop him, he'd pushed back the lace and glove to reveal the white bandage beneath. A small spot of red had seeped through the fabric. The ballroom went absolutely silent. The vampire's silver eyes lifted to hers, and something flickered in their depths, something that might have been anger or might have been concern. She couldn't tell. His voice was soft now, deadly soft. No one. He released her arm but didn't step back. Instead, he leaned closer, and Clara caught the faint smell of cedar and night air. These are defensive wounds, 5 days old, made with a blade, not garden shears. Clara's breath caught. How could he possibly— I am Dmitri Dragomir, he said, his gaze never leaving hers. Master of this house and keeper of its laws. The word hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud. Vampires. Clara should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee back through those gates and never look back. But something in Dimitri's eyes held her captive, not magic, but something more unsettling. Recognition. As if he saw the wounds beneath her wounds, the ones that had nothing to do with blades. The ball, Dmitri said, straightening and offering his arm with old-world formality, will proceed as planned. You will remain at my side for the evening. We have much to discuss, Miss Ashford. Clara whispered. His smile was razor-sharp. Then we discuss it anyway. Clara looked at his offered arm, at the ballroom full of immortal creatures watching her with hunger and curiosity, at the door that suddenly seemed very far away. Then she looked at Dimitri's face and saw that flicker again in his silver eyes. Not hunger, concern. She took his arm. Wise choice, he murmured, and led her into the heart of his kingdom. Chapter 2. The Rules of Night. Dmitri guided Clara through the crowd with a possessive ease that made it clear she was under his protection. The other vampires watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hunger, but none approached. They simply parted like a dark sea, their conversations resuming in whispers that sounded like wind through dead leaves. Clara's arm trembled against his, and Dmitri felt the rapid flutter of her pulse where his fingers rested above her glove. Fear, yes, but also something else. Exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying weight for too long. You're afraid, he observed, leading her toward a quieter alcove away from the main floor. I'm in a room full of vampires, Clara replied, her voice tight. He gestured to a velvet settee positioned beneath a towering portrait of a woman in Renaissance dress, his mother, 3 centuries dead and still beautiful in oils and memory. Sit. Clara hesitated, then sank onto the settee with a grace that suggested she'd once been trained in such things. Dmitri remained standing, studying her in the candlelight. She was pretty in a fragile, fading way, dark hair pulled back in a simple style, brown eyes too large in a pale face, the kind of beauty that grief was slowly eroding. The wounds, he said directly. Dmitri crossed his arms, aware that looming over her was a power play but unable to stop himself. Centuries of dominance didn't simply vanish because a mortal woman looked at him with defiant exhaustion. You demanded my presence, Clara shot back, and there was the fire he'd sensed beneath her fear. 3 times. Dimitri's jaw tightened. That was 50 years ago, and he'd murdered 3 children. He crouched down to her eye level, making himself smaller, less threatening, an old trick that rarely failed. I invited you because your name appeared in my ledgers. 6 months ago, you purchased the old Ashford estate, a property that has been in my family's protection for 200 years. Clara blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Every mortal family in this valley lives under House Dragomir's law, in exchange for certain considerations. He watched her process this, saw the moment understanding dawned. My uncle left me the estate in his will, Clara said slowly. I inherited it 3 months ago. Before that, I lived in London. I didn't know about any." Dimitri reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her bandaged wrist again. This time she let him. She nodded, mute. He unwrapped the bandage with careful precision, revealing what he'd already scented, a series of deliberate cuts, thin and parallel, made with something sharp. Not deep enough to be fatal, but deep enough to hurt, to release something. "A blade," he said quietly, examining the wounds without touching them. "Something small, a letter opener, perhaps." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. She pulled her arm back, cradling it against her chest. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Because sometimes the pain inside needs somewhere to go, and cutting it open feels like—" Dimitri sat back on his heels, centuries of existence suddenly feeling inadequate. He'd seen wars, plagues, the rise and fall of kingdoms. He'd killed men and monsters alike. But this quiet, personal devastation was something else entirely. He asked, "That's not who hurt?" Each word came out harder than the last. Clara's eyes met his, and for the first time since she'd entered his home, he saw the full depth of what she carried. Betrayal, shame, a grief so profound it had nearly destroyed her. "My husband," she said finally. "Ex-husband. He took everything. My reputation, my father's company, my home in London. He made sure everyone believed I was the one who'd betrayed him, who'd stolen from the business. By the time the truth came out, it was too late." She laughed, bitter and broken. "Uncle George's estate was my last refuge, a crumbling house in a forgotten valley. Started 4 weeks ago, after I found him remarried in the society pages." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "Some nights the walls feel too close, the silence too loud." Dimitri understood emptiness. He'd lived with it for 3 centuries, ever since the night he'd been turned against his will and watched his mortal family age and die while he remained frozen at 32. He'd built House Dragomir from that emptiness, carved out power and territory, created laws and order because chaos hurt too much, but he'd never tried to bleed it out. "The wounds will scar," he said, standing and offering his hand. Clara stared at his outstretched hand. "My blood, applied topically. It accelerates mortal healing by days, sometimes weeks." He kept his hand steady, waiting. No strings attached, no blood debt. Dimitri held her gaze. Clara looked at his hand for a long moment. Around them, the ball continued, music drifting in from the main hall, laughter that sounded almost human, the soft whisper of creatures pretending to be civilized. Finally, she placed her hand in his. "Just the healing," she said firmly. "Just the healing," Dimitri agreed, pulling her to her feet. Chapter 3. Blood and Silver. Dimitri led Clara through a side corridor, away from the glittering crowd and into the older parts of the manor. The music faded behind them, replaced by the hollow echo of their footsteps on stone floors. Candlelight flickered in wall sconces, casting dancing shadows that made the portraits lining the hallway seem alive. Clara asked, her voice echoing slightly, "Somewhere private." Dimitri pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing what appeared to be a private study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes that ranged from ancient leather-bound manuscripts to modern hardcovers. A fire burned in the marble fireplace, and 2 wing-backed chairs faced it. "My personal sanctuary." Clara stepped inside, taking in the room with obvious curiosity. Her gaze lingered on a chess set carved from black and white marble, frozen mid-game on a side table. "For the past 70 years, yes." Dimitri moved to a cabinet and retrieved a crystal decanter and a clean cloth. "Sit by the fire." She obeyed, settling into one of the chairs and watching as he approached. The firelight caught the silver in his eyes, making them glow almost white. Inhuman. Clara's breath quickened, and Dimitri could hear her heartbeat accelerate. "You're afraid again," he observed, kneeling beside her chair. "You're about to cut yourself and bleed on me." Despite himself, Dmitri smiled. He set the decanter and cloth on the small table beside her. "Give me your arm." Clara extended her bandaged wrist, and Dmitri carefully unwrapped it again. The cuts looked angrier in the firelight, the edges slightly inflamed. 5 days old, as he'd estimated. Made with precision. She'd known exactly where to cut to hurt without causing serious damage. He asked, examining the wounds. "And tell him what?" Clara's laugh was hollow. "I've already lost everything that mattered." "Seeking help isn't undignified." Dmitri produced a small silver knife from his jacket. More of a letter opener, really, but sharp enough. "Watch closely." He pressed the blade to his palm and drew it across in one smooth motion. Blood welled immediately, dark and surprisingly red. Not the black ichor of folklore, but crimson like any mortal's. Clara leaned forward, fascinated despite her obvious apprehension. "Vampire blood carries properties mortal science doesn't understand," Dmitri explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher. "We heal rapidly, wounds that would kill humans close in minutes." He let several drops fall onto the cloth, then pressed it firmly against Clara's wrist. She gasped, her free hand gripping the chair arm. "Burns," she managed through gritted teeth. "For a moment, yes." Dmitri kept the cloth pressed firmly, watching her face. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her jaw clenched, but she didn't pull away. Strong then, stronger than she believed. "Tell me something." "Anything. Your favorite book. The best meal you've ever eaten." Clara's breath came in short gasps, but she spoke. "Uncle George used to visit when I was a child. Summer holidays. The estate was beautiful then. Gardens everywhere, roses climbing the walls. He'd tell me stories about the old days, about the families who'd lived here for generations. It felt safe." "It is outside of time," Dmitri said quietly. "The valley exists under different rules. Older rules. House Dragomir. We're not the only vampires in existence, but we're the only ones who rule openly. Other houses hide, blend in, pretend to be human." He lifted the cloth slightly, checking the wounds. Already the inflammation had decreased, the edges beginning to knit together. "We made a covenant with the mortals here 300 years ago." Clara's voice was steadier now, the pain clearly subsiding. Dmitri hesitated. "Blood rights, consensual only. We have strict laws about that. Volunteers receive compensation, security, and access to our resources. It's not the savage feeding of legends. It's civilized." "Some of us do. I haven't fed from a mortal in over a decade. I prefer—" He applied fresh blood to the cloth and moved to her other wrist. "I'm telling you this because you live under our law now, whether you knew it or not." Clara absorbed this in silence, watching as he tended to her second wrist with the same careful attention. The intimacy of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. His hands gentle despite their strength, her trust despite every reason to fear him. She asked finally. Dmitri met her eyes. "Because 3 nights ago I was reviewing territorial reports and found something disturbing. Your estate sits on the border between House Dragomir and House Corvinus. Our territories have been contested for centuries, but we maintain an uneasy peace. Recently, Corvinus has been testing those boundaries, moving markers. I think they want a foothold in my territory." He finished with her second wrist and sat back, his palm already healed without a trace. "From worse than vampires. Victor Corvinus doesn't simply kill his enemies. He collects them, breaks them." Dmitri's voice went cold. "I've seen his work." Clara looked down at her wrists. The wounds had closed completely, leaving only faint pink lines that would likely fade by morning. Dmitri stood, offering his hand once more. "And now you need to know more about this world you've stumbled into. Especially tonight." Dmitri's expression hardened. Chapter 4. The Rival. Clara felt Dimitri's entire demeanor shift the moment the words left his mouth. The careful gentleness evaporated, replaced by something coiled and predatory. His silver eyes fixed on the door as if he could see through it to whatever threat approached. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice dropping to a command. "Don't speak unless spoken to directly. Don't accept anything he offers, food, drink, or conversation." "Good." Dimitri moved to the door, but paused, glancing back at her. Something flickered across his face. Concern again, warring with cold strategy. "Victor is older than I am. Stronger. He plays games with mortal lives the way children play with toys. He already knows you're in the manor." Dimitri extended his hand. "Trust me, I've navigated his moods for 2 centuries. Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then at her healed wrists. He'd helped her without asking for anything in return, had explained rather than commanded, had shown her a gentleness she hadn't expected from a creature of legend. She took his hand. They returned to the ballroom together, and Clara immediately understood why Dimitri had been concerned. The entire atmosphere had changed. Where before the vampires had been socializing with almost human normalcy, now they stood in careful groupings, their attention focused on the figure holding court at the center of the room. Victor Corvinus was beautiful in the way poisonous things are beautiful, striking and lethal. Taller than Dimitri, with platinum hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes like chips of amber, he wore crimson velvet that made him look like a Renaissance prince. When he smiled, his fangs showed deliberately, a reminder that civility was a choice he could revoke at any moment. Victor's voice carried across the ballroom, warm and welcoming and completely false. "How gracious of you to finally join your own celebration." "Never, Victor." Dimitri's grip on Clara's hand tightened fractionally as he guided her forward. "Welcome to House Dragomir." The words were ritual, Clara realized, diplomatic theater. Victor's amber eyes slid to her, and Clara felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, ancient, hungry, calculating. Victor moved closer with fluid grace, circling them both. "She smells mortal. How—" "Clara Ashford," Dimitri said before she could speak. "The new owner of the Ashford estate." Victor's smile widened. "That border property? How fascinating. I've been admiring that estate myself." "The property is under House Dragomir protection," Dimitri said smoothly. Victor waved a dismissive hand, but his eyes never left Clara. "Though borders are such fluid things, aren't they?" Clara felt the threat beneath the pleasant words. This was about more than property. This was about power, territory, old grudges dressed in modern courtesy. "Miss Ashford," Victor said, addressing her directly now, "you must be terribly overwhelmed, a mortal among immortals, alone and unprotected." "She's not unprotected," Dimitri cut in, his voice sharp. Victor's smile turned predatory. "Then perhaps you've offered her a blood bond, marked her officially as under your personal protection? Because without such formalities, she's simply a mortal in contested territory." The ballroom had gone completely silent. Every vampire present watched the exchange with predatory interest, sensing the challenge beneath Victor's words. "Clara is my guest," Dimitri said carefully. Victor moved closer to Clara, and she felt Dimitri tense beside her. "What happens when she returns to that lovely estate? Alone, vulnerable." Dimitri's voice carried a warning. Victor's eyes glittered with amusement. "These are dangerous times. Accidents happen. Mortals wander into the wrong territories and simply disappear." Clara found her voice, surprising herself. Both vampires looked at her sharply. Dimitri's expression flickered with concern, but Victor's lit with interest. "Brave and foolish," Victor purred, "my favorite combination." "Don't answer him," Dimitri said quietly, but Clara was tired of being a pawn in games she didn't understand. "No, he hasn't." Victor's laugh was rich and dark. "A blood bond is a formal protection. The vampire marks the mortal with their blood, not just healing, but a deeper exchange. It announces to all other vampires that the mortal is claimed, protected, untouchable. Clara asked, though she suspected she knew. Access. The vampire may feed when needed. Not constantly. We're not monsters, despite the legends. But the bond requires... Victor's smile was knowing. It's quite intimate, really. That's enough, Dimitri said, stepping between them. Clara is under my guest protection tonight, and I will personally ensure her safety beyond that. Victor's eyes danced with malicious pleasure. How intriguing. I wonder what our dear Dimitri sees in you, Miss Ashford. Before Clara could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A young vampire, barely more than a boy, burst into the ballroom, his face pale with fear. My Lord Dimitri, he gasped. The Ashford estate. Clara's heart stopped. Everything she owned, everything left of her uncle's memory, her last refuge in the world. How convenient, Victor said softly, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Dimitri was already moving, pulling Clara with him. Minutes ago, my lord. Clara felt the world tilting, her carefully rebuilt life crumbling again, but Dimitri's hand was firm in hers, steady and strong. We're leaving, he said. But the ball, someone protested. Dimitri's voice carried absolute authority. He looked back at Victor once, his expression promising future consequences. I look forward to it, Victor replied, raising a glass in mock salute. Chapter 5. Ashes and Sanctuary. The night air bit cold against Clara's face as Dimitri's car, a sleek black vehicle that seemed to devour the road, raced through the valley. She gripped the door handle, watching the darkness blur past, her mind unable to process what was happening. Everything. She was losing everything again. Breathe, Dimitri said, his hands steady on the wheel despite their speed. My home is burning. I know. And we'll assess the damage when we arrive. His tone was sharp, but not unkind, the voice of someone accustomed to crisis. Focus on facts. The messenger said the West Wing. That's the oldest part of the structure, mostly stone. Clara forced herself to breathe slower, deeper. I know he did. The timing is too convenient. Dimitri's jaw tightened. It's a classic Corvinus play. Why? Because the estate sits on high ground between our territories. Whoever controls it controls the valley's strategic center. Victor has been trying to gain that foothold for 50 years. The pieces clicked together in Clara's exhausted mind. Yes, a formal arrangement. When he died without direct heirs, the property should have reverted to House Dragomir's oversight. Instead, he willed it to you. A niece in London who knew nothing of our world. Dimitri's expression was grim. I underestimated his intelligence network. Clara looked at her healed wrists, at this vampire who'd shown her more care in one evening than most humans had in months. The blood bond he mentioned. To guarantee your absolute safety? Yes. But it's not a decision to make lightly, Clara. A blood bond lasts years, sometimes decades. Tell me honestly. Dimitri was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. The bond creates awareness. I would know when you're hurt, afraid, in danger. I could find you anywhere in the valley. And yes, there's a compulsion aspect. I could command you if necessary. Most vampires abuse that power. Once, perhaps twice a month. It wouldn't weaken you significantly, and it wouldn't be unpleasant. He glanced at her. I won't lie and pretend it's purely transactional. There's intimacy in it. Clara's stomach twisted with conflicting emotions, fear, curiosity, and something she didn't want to name. Given that your house is currently burning? They crested a hill, and Clara's breath caught. The Ashford estate sprawled below them, and the West Wing was indeed engulfed in flames that reached toward the black sky. Fire crews had arrived, mortals shouting, hoses spraying, the whole scene chaotic with emergency lights. But it was too late. Clara could see that even from here. Dmitri parked at a distance and helped her from the car. They approached on foot, and Clara felt her carefully maintained composure finally crack. The West Wing had housed Uncle George's library, his personal papers, the family portraits dating back 200 years, all of it burning. The fire chief approached, his face soot-streaked and grave. "Thank God. We couldn't reach you." "Electrical fault," Dmitri repeated, his tone making it clear he believed nothing of the sort. "How thorough?" "No, ma'am. The property was empty, but the West Wing is a total loss, and the fire's spreading." Clara watched flames consume the windows of her uncle's study. She'd sat in that study 3 months ago, crying as she read his will, grateful for this one small kindness in a world that had shown her only cruelty. Now even that was being taken. The fire chief's voice seemed distant. "Are you all right? Perhaps you should sit." Her knees buckled, and suddenly Dmitri was there, catching her before she fell. He lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. "I'm taking her somewhere safe," he told the fire chief. "Send reports to Dragomir Manor." "But sir, this is her property," "which sits on land under my family's historical protection." Dmitri's voice carried absolute authority. The fire chief paled slightly. "No, sir. Of course not." Dmitri carried Clara back to the car. She didn't protest, couldn't find the energy. Everything felt numb, distant, as if she were watching her life burn from outside her own body. "I can't lose this," she whispered against his chest. "Not again." Dmitri settled her into the passenger seat, then crouched beside her, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me, Clara. You will stay at Dragomir Manor tonight. Tomorrow, we'll assess the damage and begin rebuilding." The words were simple, absolute. "If you accept my protection, formal protection, you'll have the full resources of House Dragomir, builders, security, legal leverage. We can discuss terms, boundaries." Dmitri's hand covered hers, warm despite everything she'd believed about vampires being cold. "But Clara, you need to understand. Once you're under my protection, you're mine, not as property, but as responsibility. I will defend you with everything I have." Clara looked past him at the burning estate, then back at his silver eyes, ancient and knowing and somehow kind despite their inhumanity. She'd run to this valley to disappear, to hide from a world that had broken her. But maybe hiding was never the answer. She asked. Dmitri's expression shifted, relief mixed with something darker, more possessive. "First, you come home with me." "Home," Clara repeated. The word felt foreign. Dragomir Manor. For tonight, at least. He stood, closing her door with gentle finality. "Welcome to my world, Clara Ashford." "Good," Clara said, surprising herself. Chapter 6. The Ancient Oath. Dragomir Manor felt different in the deep hours of night, after the ball's glittering crowds had dispersed. Clara followed Dmitri through silent corridors, lit only by moonlight through tall windows, her footsteps echoing on marble floors. The other vampires had vanished. To their own quarters or hunting grounds, she didn't want to know. "The guest wing is being prepared," Dmitri said, leading her up a spiral staircase. "But given the circumstances, I'd prefer you closer to my private chambers." "You think he'd attack me here?" "I think Victor respects strength and little else." They reached a landing, and Dmitri opened a heavy door. "These rooms connect to mine through an interior passage." The suite was beautiful in a Gothic way. 4-poster bed draped in dark velvet, a fireplace already burning, tall windows overlooking the valley. Clara could see the distant glow of her estate still burning, and her chest tightened. "I should call someone. The insurance company." "Tomorrow. Tonight you're exhausted and in shock." Dmitri moved to a sideboard and poured amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Brandy. Mortal vintage." Clara took the glass, but didn't drink. Dmitri was silent for a moment, his back to her as he stared into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Because I remember what it feels like to lose everything in a single night." He turned, and his silver eyes held old pain. I was turned against my will in 1692, dragged from my family's estate and transformed by a vampire who thought my bloodline would make me powerful. I watched my wife and children grow old and die while I remained frozen. Clara set down the untouched brandy, her throat tight. Don't be. He crossed to her, his movements fluid and predatory. But it also means I understand what you're feeling. The cuts, Clara whispered, were a symptom of deeper wounds. Dimitri reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The blood bond I'm offering isn't just protection, Clara. It's partnership. You'll have access to resources that can rebuild your life properly, security that goes beyond locked doors. The intimacy of his touch, the promise in his words, terrified and tempted her in equal measure. Blood exchange. You drink from me first, just a few drops, mixed with wine to ease the taste. Then I feed from you. Dimitri's thumb traced her jawline, feather light. The process is intense. You'll feel everything I feel for a moment. My age, my power, my hunger. You'll carry my mark, invisible to mortals, but clear to any vampire. Your blood will taste of House Dragomir, warning others that harming you means war with me. And I'll feel your emotions, your fear, your pain. Distance won't matter. Clara's heart raced. That's not protection. It can be, if abused. Dimitri stepped back, giving her space. I'm offering terms, boundaries we both agree to. You keep your autonomy, your right to refuse me. Negotiable. When, where, how often. Some bonds require weekly feeding. I'm proposing monthly, unless circumstances demand otherwise. Clara moved to the window, staring out at the valley that had become her prison and sanctuary both. Victor's threat hung over her like a blade. Without protection, she was vulnerable. But accepting Dimitri's bond meant surrendering something she'd fought to reclaim, her independence. She asked quietly, I'll protect you as best I can through other means. Increased security, legal barriers, diplomatic pressure on Victor, but it won't be absolute. He'll find gaps, exploit weaknesses. You become untouchable. Victor can posture and threaten, but harming you would violate every law we've built over centuries. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back, pale and exhausted. Behind her, Dimitri waited with preternatural patience. I need guarantees, she said finally. Written terms. Of course. I'll have documents drawn up by tomorrow evening. Agreed, though breaking a bond prematurely is painful for both parties. And I want my estate rebuilt, exactly as it was. Done. I'll assign my best architect and cover all costs. Clara turned to face him, this ancient creature who somehow saw her as worth saving. Why are you being so reasonable? Because I learned over 3 centuries that fear and force create only resentment and rebellion. Dimitri's expression softened. And because something about you reminds me of who I was before the darkness took me. The fire crackled in the silence between them. Outside, dawn was still hours away, that strange liminal time when darkness felt absolute. I accept, Clara whispered. Your protection. The bond. Dimitri nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his features. Then tomorrow night, once you've rested and reviewed the formal terms, we'll perform the ritual. For tonight, simply sleep. You're safe here, Clara. He moved toward the connecting door. I'll be in the next room if you need anything. He paused, looking back. Thank you. His smile was sad and ancient. No one should have to beg for safety. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Clara listened to his footsteps fade, then locked the door as he'd suggested. Not because she didn't trust him, but because some habits of self-preservation ran too deep to ignore. She collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, too exhausted for anything else. As sleep finally claimed her, her last thought was that she'd just agreed to bind herself to a vampire, And somehow, that felt like the first smart decision she'd made in months. Chapter 7. Invasion at Dawn. Clara woke to the sound of shattering glass. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came rushing back. The ball, the fire, Dragomir Manor. She sat up in the unfamiliar bed, heart hammering, as footsteps thundered through the corridor outside her room. The connecting door to Dimitri's chambers burst open. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, still dressed in his formal attire from the night before, his silver eyes blazing with cold fury. "Stay here," he commanded. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone except—" Another crash, closer this time, shouting in a language Clara didn't recognize, then a scream, abruptly cut off. Dimitri crossed to her in 3 strides, pressing something small and silver into her hand. Iron dagger, coated in extract of vervain. It won't kill a vampire, but it'll hurt like hell and buy you time. Dimitri? I need to protect the manor. His hand cupped her face briefly, an unexpectedly gentle gesture. Trust me. Then he was gone, moving with inhuman speed. Clara heard the door lock click from the outside. He'd sealed her in. Protected or trapped, she couldn't tell which. She clutched the dagger and moved away from the door, positioning herself where she could see both entrances. Her medical training from university kicked in. Assess the situation, control your breathing, prepare for action. The skills she'd learned before dropping out to marry a man who'd destroyed her life. More sounds of combat filtered through the walls. Crashes, growls that sounded nothing like human throats should produce, and underneath it all, a wet tearing sound that made her stomach turn. Minutes crawled past. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the dagger. She'd agreed to enter this world, but she hadn't expected to be thrust into its violence so quickly. A shadow passed by the window. Clara's breath caught. She was 3 stories up. Nothing should be outside that window. But the shadow came again, and this time she saw the silhouette clearly. A man, climbing the manor's stone walls like a spider. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass. A vampire landed in a crouch amid the shards, young, with wild dark hair and eyes that gleamed red in the firelight. He wore no house colors, but Clara knew instinctively he was Victor's creature. He smiled, revealing elongated fangs. "Hello, little mortal," he purred, straightening. Clara backed toward the connecting door, dagger raised. "Or what?" He laughed, advancing slowly. "I can smell your fear. It's delicious. I'm under House Dragomir protection. Guest rights were violated the moment Victor's forces entered this manor." He inhaled deeply. "And you smell unmarked. No bond. No claim." Clara's back hit the door. She fumbled with the handle, but Dimitri had locked it from the outside. The vampire watched her struggle with predatory amusement. "He locked you in to keep you safe," he said. "How sweet." He lunged. Clara didn't think. She reacted. Years of her father's self-defense lessons, buried under years of learned helplessness, suddenly surfaced. She dropped under his reaching arms and drove the dagger upward, aiming for where his throat should be. The blade connected. The vampire screamed, a sound so inhuman it raised every hair on Clara's body. He stumbled back, clawing at the dagger protruding from his neck. Smoke rose from the wound, and his skin blackened around the iron and vervain. "Bitch!" he gasped, his voice garbled. The connecting door exploded off its hinges. Dimitri appeared like an avenging shadow, his elegant clothing splattered with blood, his expression absolutely feral. He took in the scene. Broken window, wounded vampire, Clara pressed against the wall with empty hands, in a single glance. What happened next was too fast for Clara to fully process. Dimitri moved like liquid darkness, crossing the room in a blur. His hand closed around the wounded vampire's throat, and there was a wet, tearing sound. The vampire's scream died to a gurgle, then silence. When Dimitri stepped back, the intruder crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Dimitri's voice was rough, barely controlled. He turned to Clara, and she saw his fangs were fully extended, his eyes wild with bloodlust and rage.
"No, the dagger. You defended yourself."
He crossed to her, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch her.
"Glass in your arms. Small cuts. The dagger must have, when you stabbed him."
He seemed to be struggling for coherent thought. Clara looked down and realized blood was running down her forearms. She must have gotten cut by the flying glass when the window shattered. The pain hadn't registered until now, adrenaline masking everything. "It's not deep," she said, though her voice shook. Dimitri's pupils dilated, his nostrils flaring.
"You're bleeding, in a room full of—"
He turned away sharply, his fists clenched.
"I need to get you out of here."
"We're winning. Victor underestimated our defenses, thought a dawn assault would catch us sleeping." He stripped off his ruined jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Clara nodded, though her legs felt like water. Dimitri swept her up before she could protest, cradling her against his chest as he'd done at the fire.
"Hold tight. The safest place in the manor is the old cellar. It's where we store—"
He paused.
"It's secure. No windows. Single entrance. The other vampires, your people, will hold until I return."
His voice was fierce, protective.
"Victor sent someone after you specifically, because he knows I've chosen to protect you."
Dimitri's arms tightened around her. They moved through corridors painted with violence, overturned furniture, scorch marks on walls, bodies Clara tried not to look at too closely. Dimitri navigated it all with preternatural grace, never stumbling, never hesitating. They descended a narrow stone staircase that spiraled deep into the manor's foundation. The air grew colder, heavier with age and earth. Finally, they reached a heavy iron door carved with symbols Clara didn't recognize. Dimitri set her down carefully and pressed his palm to the door. It swung open with a deep groan.
"Inside,"
he said. Clara stepped into darkness, and Dimitri followed, the door sealing shut behind them with a resonant boom that felt final as a tomb closing. Chapter 8. Blood in the Dark. The cellar plunged into absolute darkness as the door sealed shut. Clara's breath came quick and shallow, panic rising in her chest. She was underground, in the dark, with a vampire whose control was clearly fracturing. Then light bloomed, soft, amber, emanating from sconces that lined the stone walls. Dimitri must have triggered them somehow. As Clara's eyes adjusted, she took in their surroundings. The cellar was ancient, its vaulted ceiling supported by thick stone pillars. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles covered in dust and cobwebs. Wine, she realized, though some of the bottles looked centuries old. But it was what occupied the center of the room that made her stomach clench. A heavy wooden table, its surface stained dark, with leather restraints hanging from its edges.
"Don't,"
Dimitri said sharply, noticing her gaze.
"Don't imagine what you're imagining. That table is for blood bonds. The restraints are for the mortal's safety during the transformation of consciousness."
Clara forced herself to breathe.
"I wasn't—" "Yes, you were. I can hear your heartbeat."
Dimitri moved to a cabinet and retrieved clean cloth and a basin.
"Sit."
Clara perched on the edge of the table, watching as he filled the basin from a water pump in the corner. His movements were precise, controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched periodically. "You're struggling," she said quietly. He brought the basin to her, setting it down with careful deliberation. "You're bleeding. I haven't fed in 3 weeks, and the battle upstairs has my instincts in full predator mode." His laugh was bitter. "Your faith is touching and naive. I've lived 3 centuries. I've done things that would give you nightmares." Clara extended her arms despite the warning. "Then prove they're not." Dimitri stared at her for a long moment, his silver eyes reflecting lamplight like a predator's. Then, with visible effort, he began cleaning the glass cuts on her forearms. His touch was gentle, professional, but Clara could feel the tremor in his fingers. "You stabbed him," Dimitri said, focusing on the task. "The vampire who came through your window." "My father."
Before he lost everything to my husband's schemes, he was military, taught me basic self-defense. Clara winced as Dmitri picked a shard of glass from a deeper cut. Muscle memory is a powerful thing. He cleaned the wound with steady hands. I didn't want to kill him. Dmitri's voice was hard. You need to understand, Clara. This world doesn't reward mercy. Is that what happened to you? His hands stilled. My wife, Catherine. She was sick. Consumption, they called it then. I begged the vampire who turned me to save her. He refused, said mortal lives were beneath his concern. Dmitri's voice went hollow. It didn't. Vampiric blood only works on injuries, not disease. Clara's throat tightened. He resumed cleaning her wounds, his movements mechanical. I learned then that this world operates on power, not kindness. Victor understands that. He'll use every weakness, exploit every mercy. Tonight? But the terms, the documents, can wait. Victor just proved he's willing to attack you in my own home. The only thing keeping you alive right now is my physical presence. Once the bond is complete, my protection becomes metaphysical. Dmitri set aside the cloth and met her gaze. I'm asking you to trust me, Clara. Clara's mind raced. Everything was happening too fast. The fire, the attack, now this. But Dmitri was right. Victor had sent an assassin into her room. What would stop him from trying again? The feeding, she said. Will you be able to control yourself? Barely, but the ritual feeding is different from hunting. Dmitri's hands clenched into fists. I won't lie. It will be intense, for both of us. But I've performed blood bonds before. Twice. Once in 1847, protecting a merchant's daughter from a rival house. Once in 1923, bonding with a mortal ally during the war. He stepped back, giving her space. I'm not asking for forever, Clara. Just enough time to eliminate Victor's threat and rebuild your life. Clara looked at the table with its ominous restraints, at Dmitri standing rigid with the effort of control, at her own bandaged arms. She thought of her burned estate, her destroyed reputation, the countless ways the world had already broken her. She asked. Relief flickered across Dmitri's face. Lie on the table. Clara climbed onto the table, the wood smooth and cool beneath her. Use them. Dmitri secured the leather straps around her wrists and ankles, checking each one carefully. He moved to the cabinet and retrieved an ornate chalice, tarnished silver etched with symbols. Then he returned to the table, rolling up his sleeve to expose his forearm. First, you drink from me, he said, producing a small blade. Just a few drops mixed with wine to ease the taste. It will feel strange, warmth spreading through your chest, my presence in your mind. His eyes met hers, and in their silver depths she saw hunger and restraint warring. Clara's heart raced as Dmitri drew the blade across his palm, letting blood drip into the chalice. Last chance to refuse, he said softly. Clara thought of Victor's predatory smile, of her home burning, of all the times she'd felt powerless and broken. Then she looked at Dmitri, this ancient creature who'd shown her more honest care than any mortal. I'm not refusing, she said. Dmitri's expression softened into something almost human. Chapter 9. The Bond. Dmitri poured wine into the chalice, the deep burgundy mixing with his blood until the liquid turned almost black in the lamplight. He swirled it gently, then brought it to Clara's lips. Slowly, he instructed, his voice taking on a ritual quality. Let it coat your tongue. Clara parted her lips, and he tipped the chalice carefully. The taste hit her, wine and copper and something else, something wild and ancient that made her head spin. It was warm, almost hot, sliding across her tongue like liquid fire. Swallow, Dmitri commanded. She obeyed. The warmth exploded through her chest, radiating outward like she'd swallowed the sun. Clara gasped, her back arching against the table, and suddenly she felt him,
Dimitri's presence in her mind, vast and old and terrifyingly powerful. 300 years of memories pressed against her consciousness, not overwhelming her but making themselves known. She felt his loneliness, his rigid self-control, his fear that he'd become exactly what he'd been fighting against. "Breathe through it." Dimitri's voice came from very far away. "The connection will stabilize." Clara forced air into her lungs, and gradually the overwhelming presence receded to something more manageable. A warmth in her chest, like a second heartbeat that wasn't quite her own. She could still feel him there, sense his emotions, but it no longer threatened to drown her. "Good," Dimitri said, and she heard the relief in his voice. "Very good." "I feel you," Clara whispered. "Inside my head. It's intrusive." "I know." He set the chalice aside and moved closer, his hand hovering over her throat where her pulse beat visibly. "Now comes the difficult part." Clara's bound hands clenched. "No. The venom in our bite is designed to make feeding pleasurable for the donor." His fingers traced her jawline, tilting her head to expose her neck. "But pleasure can be overwhelming in its own way. Some mortals become— And you? Everything you feel. Through the bond, I'll experience your fear, your pain, your pleasure. It's what makes bonding different from simple feeding. There's no distance, no separation." Dimitri leaned closer, and Clara felt his breath against her throat. "I won't." But his voice carried a note of wonder, as if trust was something rare and precious. "Here we go." His lips pressed against her throat, gentle at first, almost tender. Then she felt the sharp sting of fangs piercing skin, and her body went rigid. The pain lasted only a second. Then came the pleasure. It flooded through her like warm honey, thick and sweet and utterly disarming. Every nerve ending came alive, singing with sensation. Clara heard herself gasp, felt her fingers dig into her palms despite the restraints. It was like nothing she'd ever experienced, intimate beyond words, vulnerable beyond reason. And through the bond, she felt Dimitri's response. His hunger, yes, but also his desperate control. The war raging inside him between instinct and will. He was tasting not just her blood, but her essence, her grief, her strength, her determination to survive. And it was affecting him more than he'd expected. "Clara," his voice resonated in her mind, not spoken but felt. "You taste like sunlight and sorrow, like everything I've lost and everything I'm trying to protect." Her response came without words, pure emotion flowing through the bond. "Then protect me, and let me protect you back." Dimitri pulled away with visible effort, his fangs retracting. Blood stained his lips, her blood, and his eyes had gone completely silver, glowing in the dim light. He was breathing hard, struggling for control. "Enough," he said roughly. "I feel fine. I feel—" Clara couldn't find words for what she felt. Alive, connected, seen in a way she'd never been before. "You feel the venom." Dimitri reached up and unfastened her wrist restraints with trembling hands. "The bond is complete. You're mine now." Clara sat up slowly, touching her throat. The puncture wounds had already closed, leaving only a faint mark. "I can feel you. Not just your emotions, but your presence." "That will strengthen over the next few days. Eventually you'll be able to sense my location, my physical state." Dimitri stepped back, putting distance between them. "What we just shared, the intimacy of it, some mortals find it disturbing afterward." Clara slid off the table, her legs unsteady but holding. The euphoria was fading as he'd predicted, leaving a pleasant exhaustion in its wake. "I don't need space. I need answers. Victor attacked because he wants my estate. Now we show him that his attack failed." Dimitri's expression hardened. "House Corvinus is powerful, but they can't stand against House Dragomir in open conflict. Victor knows this."
No, he'll look for other leverage, other weaknesses to exploit. Dmitri pulled out his phone, the modern technology incongruous in the ancient cellar. I'm calling my solicitor. We're going to transfer legal ownership of the Ashford estate to House Dragomir, with you as protected steward. On paper only. You'll retain full control, full residence rights. Dimitri's thumb hovered over the dial. It's the cleanest solution. Clara thought of Uncle George, of his stories about the valley, about the old families and older agreements. He'd understood this world in ways she was only beginning to grasp. He left it to me knowing this would happen, she said slowly, knowing I'd have to ally with you to survive. Your uncle was a brilliant strategist. Dimitri's expression was respectful. He knew Victor would move on the property eventually. By willing it to an outsider, to you, he forced my hand. You were the catalyst for change. Dmitri made the call, speaking rapidly in what sounded like Latin before switching to English. Yes, immediate transfer. He hung up and looked at Clara. It's done. As of now, the Ashford estate is House Dragomir property. A distant boom shook the cellar, an explosion from somewhere above. Dimitri's head snapped toward the sound, and through the bond, Clara felt his sudden spike of alarm. Victor's retreating. Dmitri moved to the door. Stay here. Clara, we're bonded now. Partners, you said. Dmitri looked at her, this mortal woman who'd lost everything and still chose to stand rather than hide, and something fierce and protective blazed in his eyes. Then stay close, he said. And if I tell you to run, you run. Clara squared her shoulders. Together they ascended from the depths, moving toward the sound of destruction and whatever dawn would bring. Chapter 10. Dawn's Reckoning. They emerged from the cellar into chaos barely contained. The grand entrance hall Clara had admired the night before was transformed. Furniture overturned. Portraits slashed, the marble floor cracked and stained with blood. Dimitri's vampires moved through the wreckage with grim efficiency, securing the perimeter and tending to the wounded. A tall woman with silver hair approached, her elegant gown torn and splattered. My lord, Victor's forces have withdrawn. 5 of ours injured, 2 of theirs destroyed completely. Dimitri's voice was clipped, commanding. None dead. Marcus lost an arm, but he'll regenerate. The real damage is structural. They set charges in the East Wing Library and the Portrait Gallery. Dimitri's jaw tightened. Centuries of records. Destroyed to make a point, the woman said bitterly. Then her eyes landed on Clara, and her nostrils flared slightly. This is Clara Ashford, Dmitri said, his hand moving to Clara's lower back in an unmistakably possessive gesture. Under my formal protection. Elena's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. Victor attacked first. Dimitri's tone brooked no argument. Spread word through the valley. Clara Ashford is House Dragomir. Elena bowed slightly to Clara. Welcome to the house, Miss Ashford, though I wish the circumstances were less. Another explosion rocked the manor, this one more distant. Through the shattered windows, Clara saw flames rising from the eastern grounds. The stables, Elena reported grimly. Dmitri asked, 20 minutes. Then Victor's running out of time. Dmitri turned to Clara. The blood bond makes you a target now more than ever. I know that. Dimitri's hand tightened on her back. Elena, take Clara to the reinforced chambers. Clara's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. I stay with you. We're bonded, remember? If I'm in danger, you'll feel it anyway. It keeps you alive, Dmitri said sharply. For how long? Clara met his silver eyes without flinching. I'm tired of hiding, Dmitri. From my ex-husband, from scandal, from life itself. You said the bond makes us partners. Elena watched the exchange with barely concealed interest. Dmitri stared at Clara for a long moment, and through the bond she felt his internal struggle, the desire to protect warring with respect for her autonomy. You stay behind me, he said finally. and if I give an order, you follow it without question. Elena, gather the council. Dmitri strode toward what remained of the grand staircase, Clara at his side. He wants war? They ascended to a second-floor balcony that overlooked the entrance hall. Below, Dmitri's vampires assembled, perhaps 30 of them, all bearing the marks of recent combat. Some wore modern clothing, others styles from centuries past. All of them looked to Dmitri with absolute loyalty. House Dragomir, Dmitri's voice carried through the hall without need for amplification. Tonight we were attacked in our own home by forces of House Corvinus. Murmurs rippled through the assembled vampires. Clara felt dozens of eyes turn to her, assessing, judging. Dmitri's hand found Clara's, lifting it so all could see the faint mark on her throat. She is now House Dragomir. Her blood carries my mark. Her life is my responsibility. Victor will call this an act of war, someone called from below. Victor already declared war when he burned Miss Ashford's home and sent assassins into mine. Dmitri's expression was cold, absolute. The border estate is now formally House Dragomir property. Miss Ashford remains as steward with full rights and protections, Elena asked. Then we go to tribunal and let the old houses decide. But Victor won't risk that. Too many of them already question his aggressive expansion. Dmitri squeezed Clara's hand. Through the windows, the sky was beginning to lighten, not yet dawn, but the promise of it. Several vampires shifted nervously, ancient instincts responding to the approaching sun. Secure the manor, Dmitri commanded. Seal all light vulnerable areas. Elena, I want damage assessments within the hour. The vampires dispersed with military precision. Within moments, Clara and Dmitri stood alone on the balcony, surveying the destruction below. Your home, Clara said quietly. Dmitri turned to her, his expression softening. And it's not destroyed, it's damaged. We'll rebuild. We've handed him a stalemate. He can't take the estate, but he won't forgive the insult. This isn't over, Clara. Dmitri brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture tender despite their grim surroundings. How are you feeling? Clara assessed herself honestly. Exhausted, overwhelmed, but also more alive than she'd felt in months. I feel like I've stepped into a story I don't fully understand yet. Dmitri's thumb traced her cheekbone. You were brave tonight. His smile was genuine, almost warm. Uncle George chose well when he left you that estate. The first ray of sunlight broke over the valley, streaming through the broken windows. Dmitri flinched, stepping back into shadow. Dawn, he said. I need to retreat to the sealed chambers. You should rest. There's a guest room prepared on this floor, fully reinforced. Sleep. What about rebuilding? Dmitri guided her toward a hallway. One crisis at a time, Clara. We've survived the night. He left her at a heavy door, and Clara entered to find a comfortable room with blackout curtains and a soft bed. She collapsed onto it, still wearing her ruined ball gown, too exhausted for anything else. As consciousness faded, she felt Dmitri's presence through the bond, distant but steady, like a lighthouse in fog. She'd entered his world as a desperate refugee. She'd emerged as something neither of them had expected, an equal,